Ethan Cole has 3 days until the bank takes everything. His cattle are starving, his cabin is collapsing, and Hope died with his wife 2 winters ago. Then a woman he doesn't remember summoning arrives through a Christmas storm that should have killed her. Clara Hale isn't here to be saved, she's here to save him, whether he wants it or not. But some secrets are more dangerous than Wyoming winters, and some second chances demand a price neither of them is prepared to pay. Follow this story to the end, comment with your city so I can see how far this tale travels, and discover whether love can grow where everything else has already frozen to death. The wind came from the north like a living thing with teeth. Ethan Cole sat in the darkness of his cabin and listened to it claw at the walls, testing the joints, searching for weakness. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers that gave more shadow than warmth. He didn't bother adding wood. What was the point? In 3 days, the bank would take the ranch, the cattle, the land his father had died proving up. In 3 days, none of this would be his problem anymore. He stared at the whiskey bottle on the table, half empty, or half full, depending on whether a man still had room for optimism. Ethan had run out of that commodity somewhere around the 2nd year of drought, definitely by the time Margaret's fever had taken her, leaving him alone in a valley that felt less like home and more like a grave he was too stubborn to lie down in. Outside, the blizzard screamed. Christmas Eve, 1887. The irony wasn't lost on him. Somewhere in town, families gathered around tables groaning with food, children pressed their noses to frosted windows watching for morning, and men who'd managed their affairs better than Ethan Cole slept soundly knowing the new year wouldn't strip them of everything they'd built. He lifted the bottle, hesitated, set it down again. The knock, when it came, was so faint he thought he'd imagined it. Ethan's hand moved instinctively to the rifle propped against his chair. No one traveled in weather like this. No one sane, anyway. The wind could play tricks, make a man hear things that weren't there, see shapes in the snow that dissolved when you looked directly at them. He'd learned that the hard winter after Margaret died, when loneliness had started whispering in voices that sounded almost real. The knock came again, deliberate, human. He stood slowly, his joints protesting the cold that had settled into the cabin's bones and his own. The rifle felt heavier than it should. He crossed to the door, placed one hand on the rough wood, and listened. "Please." The voice was female, barely audible over the storm. "Please, I know someone's there. I can see the smoke." Ethan pulled the door open. The woman on his doorstep swayed like a tree about to fall. Snow covered her from head to foot, turning her into something ghostly, barely distinguishable from the white chaos behind her. Her traveling dress, once a serviceable dark wool, he guessed, was torn at the hem and crusted with ice. She wore no proper winter coat, just a thin shawl that had frozen stiff around her shoulders. Her face, what he could see of it past the scarf wrapped across her nose and mouth, was pale as death except for the raw red patches where frostbite was setting in. She held a small carpet bag in hands so frozen her fingers had locked around the handle. "Ethan Cole?" Her voice cracked on his name. He stared at her, his mind moving slowly, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "Who?" "Clara Hale." She took one step forward and nearly went down. Ethan caught her by instinct, his hands closing on arms so cold they felt like marble through the frozen fabric. "From the agency, the matrimonial agency. You wrote—" Memory hit him like a fist. 2 years ago, maybe 3. After Margaret died and the silence had grown so thick he thought it might suffocate him. The neighbors had stopped coming by. The few remaining hands had drifted to ranches with better prospects. One night, drunk and desperate and so lonely he couldn't stand the sound of his own breathing, he'd written to one of those agencies back east, the ones that advertised in papers promising suitable wives for frontier men willing to pay the arrangement fee. He'd forgotten about it the next morning, assumed nothing would come of it. That had been more than a year ago. "I sent a telegram," Clara was saying, her words tumbling over each other. 3 weeks ago. Told you I was coming, gave you the date. I thought—" She looked up at him, and he saw her eyes for the first time, dark, intelligent, currently filling with the terrible realization that she'd walked into a disaster. "You didn't get it." "No." The word came out harsher than he intended. "I didn't get any telegram." They stood in the doorway, the storm howling around them, staring at each other like two people who'd just discovered they'd been dealt into a game neither of them knew how to play. Clara's legs buckled. Ethan hauled her inside and kicked the door shut against the wind. She was shaking so hard he could feel it through her clothes. Hypothermia. He'd seen it before, knew what it looked like when cold stopped being an inconvenience and became a killer. He half carried, half dragged her to the chair closest to the hearth and pushed her into it. "Don't move." He grabbed the poker and stirred the embers, added kindling, blew on it until flames caught. Then he piled on logs without regard for conservation. If she died in his cabin on Christmas Eve, the bank could have the whole damn ranch tomorrow for all he cared. Clara hadn't moved. She sat rigid in the chair, still clutching that carpet bag, her entire body convulsing with shivers that looked violent enough to crack bone. "Put that down!" Ethan pried her fingers off the bag's handle. They didn't want to let go. He had to work each one free individually, and even then they curled back into claws. "When did you last feel your hands?" "I don't—" Her teeth chattered so hard she could barely speak. "Miles ago. Maybe the last farm." "What last farm?" He was pulling off her frozen shawl now, the scarf, trying to assess the damage. "How far did you walk?" "From town. They said—" Another violent shiver cut her off. "They said you lived at the edge of the valley. Gave me directions. It was already snowing when I started. I thought I could make it before dark." Ethan stopped moving. "You walked from Cole's Crossing? In this?" He gestured at the window where the blizzard raged. "That's 8 miles. 9.5, Clara whispered. I counted. Something shifted in his chest, something that felt dangerously close to respect for this fool woman who'd apparently decided to walk herself to death rather than admit defeat. He shoved it down. Respect wouldn't keep her alive. He went to the trunk in the corner, Margaret's trunk, the one he hadn't opened since, and pulled out blankets. They still smelled faintly of lavender. The scent hit him like a ghost's hand on his shoulder, but he ignored it. Ghosts couldn't help the living. He wrapped the blankets around Clara's shoulders, tucking them tight. "Can you feel your feet?" She nodded, then shook her head. "I don't know. Everything hurts, and nothing hurts. Does that make sense?" "Unfortunately." He knelt and started unlacing her boots. They were good leather, well-made, completely inappropriate for a Wyoming winter. City boots. "Where are you from?" "Pennsylvania, Philadelphia." Of course she was. Ethan worked one boot free. Her stocking was wet through, frozen to her skin. He peeled it off as gently as he could. Her foot was bone white, the toes an alarming shade of purple. He tested them carefully. She hissed in pain. "That's good," he said, keeping his voice level. "Pain means the blood's still moving. Can you wiggle them?" Clara tried. The toes barely moved, but they moved. Ethan released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Not frostbite. Not yet. Just damn close to it. He removed the other boot and stocking, then went to heat water. The cabin's layout was simple. One main room serving as kitchen, dining area, and living space, with a single bedroom off to the side. Everything was shabby, worn down by years of making do with too little. The stove still worked, though. He filled a pot with water from the bucket by the door and set it to warm. Not boil. Warm. Too much heat too fast could do more damage than good. Behind him, Clara had stopped shaking quite so violently. The blankets and the building fire were doing their work. She watched him move around the cabin with those dark, observant eyes. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I should have waited, found a place in town, come in the morning when the storm passed." "There's no place in town." Ethan didn't look at her. "Mrs. Henderson's boarding house burned down last summer, and in case you didn't notice, the storm wasn't planning to pass. This is a 3-day blow." Silence. Then, "Oh." The water was warm enough. He brought the pot over, set it on the floor, and guided Clara's feet into it. She gasped at the temperature, barely above body heat, but her feet were so cold it must have felt like fire. "Keep them in there," he instructed. "Move them around a little, slow. When you can feel all your toes, tell me." He stood and looked down at her properly for the first time. With the frozen layers removed, he could see her more clearly. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 25, 26. Thin, but not frail. Her face had good bones, the kind that would age well if she survived long enough to age. Dark hair pulled back in a bun that the wind had half destroyed. She wore a wedding ring on a chain around her neck. Her own, he wondered, or someone else's. She met his gaze without flinching. "Thank you for not turning me away." Wouldn't turn a dog out in that weather. He realized how harsh that sounded and almost apologized. Almost. "You hungry?" "Starving." He wasn't sure what he'd expected her to say, but the blunt honesty surprised him enough that he almost smiled. Almost. "I'll make coffee. There's some stew left from yesterday. Probably." "Probably? I'm not much of a cook." He went to the stove and investigated the pot sitting there. The stew had congealed into something that looked more like glue than food, but it was technically edible. He added water, stoked the fire, and waited for it to heat. Behind him, Clara made a small sound of relief. "I can feel them, my toes. All 10. "Good." He poured coffee, yesterday's, reheated, strong enough to stand a spoon in, and brought her a cup. She wrapped her hands around it like it was treasure. "Drink slow." She sipped, made a face, but kept drinking. "This is terrible coffee. I warned you I wasn't much of a cook. Coffee isn't cooking, it's basic survival." But there was no meanness in her voice, just observation. She took another sip. "How long have you lived alone?" Direct. No dancing around the subject. Ethan found himself oddly relieved by that. 2 years, give or take. "Your wife?" "Fever. Winter of '85. "I'm sorry." Clara looked around the cabin, and he tried to see it through her eyes. The dishes piled in the basin, the dust on every surface, the cobwebs in the corners, the general air of a place where a man had stopped caring whether he lived in a home or just a shelter from the rain. "Children?" "No." That came out harder than he intended. He turned back to the stew, stirred it more aggressively than necessary. "Just me." More silence. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind threw snow against the windows like someone trying to get in. "The telegram," Clara said finally. "The one you didn't receive. It explained everything. Who I was. When I was arriving, I thought—" She stopped, started again. "The agency said you were still interested in an arrangement, that you'd confirmed it just last month." Ethan froze with the spoon halfway to his mouth. "What?" "They said you sent payment for my travel, requested an immediate match due to—" She pulled a letter from her carpet bag, unfolded it with still clumsy fingers, and read, "Due to pressing circumstances requiring household assistance and companionship. They said you were eager to finalize the arrangement as soon as possible." He took the letter from her, stared at it. The agency's letterhead looked official enough. The signature at the bottom matched his own writing well enough to pass. But he hadn't written this, hadn't sent money, hadn't confirmed anything. Someone had, though. Someone who knew about his original inquiry. Someone who'd forged his name and paid a woman's passage west to marry a man who couldn't even keep his cattle alive. "Son of a bitch," he breathed. Clara's face had gone very still. "You didn't send this." "No. You don't want a wife." Ethan stopped. What was the truth? That he'd been drunk and desperate when he wrote that first letter? That he'd forgotten about it because he'd never really believed anyone would answer? That the idea of another person in this cabin, in Margaret's space, made his skin crawl with guilt he couldn't name? "It's complicated." "Actually," Clara said, her voice taking on an edge like frozen steel. "It's very simple. Someone lied to both of us. Someone brought me here under false pretenses. And now I'm sitting in your cabin on Christmas Eve, half frozen, completely unwanted, with no way back to town until the storm breaks." She stood up, the blankets falling away. Water sloshed out of the pot. She swayed but steadied herself with one hand on the chair. "I'll sleep in the barn," she said. "The hell you will." Ethan moved between her and the door. "There's no barn. It collapsed last spring. You'd be dead in an hour." "Then I'll—" She looked around wildly, like the cabin might suddenly produce an alternative. It didn't. Her shoulders sagged. "This is a disaster." "Yeah." He ran a hand through his hair. "Look, it's one night, maybe 2. depending on the storm. You take the bedroom. I'll sleep out here. When the weather clears, I'll take you back to town. We'll figure out what happened, and you can catch the next train east." "I can't afford the next train east." Clara sat down again, heavily, like her legs had given up. "I used everything I had to get here. The agency paid half my passage. I paid the rest. I sold everything I owned that was worth selling. I have $4.30 in my purse and one spare dress in that bag." The cabin felt very small suddenly. "Why?" The question came out before Ethan could stop it. "Why would you do that? Come west to marry a stranger?" Clara looked at him for a long moment. In the firelight, her eyes reflected amber and gold. "For the same reason you wrote to the agency in the first place, I imagine. Because staying where I was had stopped being an option." There was a story there. Maybe several. Ethan recognized the shape of it, the kind of past that chased a person, the kind that made starting over in a frozen valley at the edge of nowhere look like a reasonable choice. He'd been running from his own version for 2 years now. It hadn't worked out particularly well. The stew started bubbling. He dished it into 2 bowls, handed her one with a spoon. "Eat. You can have the bed tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out the rest." Clara took the bowl, looked at the contents. "Is this actually food?" "It's calories. That's all I'm promising." She tasted it, made a face, kept eating. "You weren't exaggerating about the cooking." They ate in silence. The wind howled, the fire crackled, snow hissed against the windows. Inside the cabin, 2 strangers who'd never meant to meet sat across from each other and contemplated the mess that fate, or someone's scheme, had dropped them into. Ethan finished first. He took his bowl to the basin, started to leave it there with the others, then thought better of it and actually washed it. When he turned back, Clara was scraping the last of the stew from her bowl, like someone who hadn't eaten in days. "When did you last have a meal?" he asked. "Yesterday morning. The conductor at the last station sold sandwiches, but they were 50 cents and I—" She stopped, set down the bowl. "I was trying to make my money last." Ethan felt something uncomfortable twist in his chest. This woman had walked 9 miles through a blizzard on an empty stomach, chasing a promise someone else had made in his name, and he'd been sitting here contemplating a whiskey bottle and foreclosure like they were his only problems. He went to the pantry, a generous word for the shelf in the corner, and pulled down what little food remained. Some hard bread, a wedge of cheese going crystalline at the edges, part of a ham he'd been rationing. He set it all on the table. "Eat what you want. I'll make more coffee." Clara stared at the food like she couldn't quite believe it was real. "Mr. Cole?" "Ethan." "Ethan." She said his name carefully, testing it. "You don't have to—" "You walked 9 miles in a blizzard. Least I can do is make sure you don't starve before morning." He paused. "And I think, given the circumstances, you should know the full situation you've landed in." He told her about the drought, the cattle dying from disease he couldn't identify and couldn't afford to treat, the loan he'd taken to buy feed that turned out to be spoiled, the bank's deadline. 3 days. Clara listened without interrupting. Her hands worked steadily, tearing bread, cutting cheese, eating with the focused efficiency of someone who'd learned not to waste food. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "That's quite a problem," she said finally. "That's one way to put it." "What will you do after they take the ranch?" Ethan shrugged. "Haven't thought that far ahead. Work someone else's land, maybe. Head to Montana, or just drink until I stop caring." "Which were you planning tonight, before I knocked?" He almost lied. The truth came out anyway. "Hadn't decided yet." Clara nodded slowly. She looked around the cabin again, but this time her gaze was different, assessing, like she was seeing past the dirt and disorder to the bones underneath. "This is good land," she said. Or it was. Was being the important word. "And the cattle, how many do you have left?" "Maybe 40 head. Half of those won't make it to spring." "What's killing them? You said disease?" "Wasting sickness. They stop eating, lose weight, just fade away. Had the vet out last summer. He didn't know. Said it might be the feed, might be the water, might be bad luck." Ethan laughed, but it had no humor in it. "I'm inclined to believe the last one." Clara stood and walked to the window. Outside, the blizzard had reached its full fury. Nothing visible but white chaos and darkness. My father was a doctor, she said to the glass. Country practice outside Philadelphia. I used to help him, learned some things, and before I... She stopped, started again. Before I left, I worked with a woman who treated animals, horses mostly, but she knew cattle too. Ethan felt something stir, something dangerous that felt like hope. He crushed it immediately. You're saying you could diagnose them? Some Philadelphia teacher who helped her father and knew a woman who maybe understood livestock? Clara turned. The firelight caught her face, throwing half of it into shadow. I'm saying I might recognize what your vet couldn't, and I'm saying I have nowhere else to go, nothing else to do, and 3 days before the bank makes all of this irrelevant anyway. She crossed her arms. What have you got to lose? Everything, Ethan thought, and nothing, both true at the same time. You're half frozen and exhausted, he said, mourning soon enough to... I'm fine. She was already pulling on her boots, his boots now, technically, since hers were still soaked. They were far too large, but she didn't seem to care. Where are the cattle? In the winter pasture, but you can't... Do you have lanterns and something waterproof I can wear? She was serious. Ethan stared at this woman who'd appeared on his doorstep like something out of a fever dream, who'd walked herself nearly to death for a marriage proposal that didn't exist, and who now wanted to tromp out into a killing blizzard to look at dying cattle. He made a decision that felt both completely insane and somehow inevitable. Margaret's coat is in the bedroom, oil canvas over wool, should fit well enough. He grabbed the lantern from the table. But Clara, if you die of exposure on my property, I'm telling everyone it was your own damn fault. For the first time since she'd arrived, Clara smiled. It transformed her face, made her look younger and fiercer all at once. Fair enough. The coat did fit, more or less. It hung to Clara's ankles where it had hit Margaret's knees, but it was warm and windproof. Ethan wrapped a scarf around her face, pulled a hat low over her ears, and shoved gloves at her that were too big, but better than nothing. Stay close to me, he ordered. You can't see 3 feet in this weather. People have frozen to death 10 yards from their own doors in storms like this. Clara nodded. Ethan lit the lantern, said a brief, bitter prayer to whatever was listening, and opened the door. The wind tried to kill them immediately. It slammed into them like a physical force, stealing breath, throwing ice into their faces hard enough to draw blood. Ethan grabbed Clara's arm and pulled her close, one hand holding the lantern high, the other locked on her wrist. The light barely penetrated the swirling white. He knew the way by feel, by memory, by the simple fact that he'd walked this path 1,000 times, and his feet knew where to go even when his eyes were useless. The pasture was a 1/4 mile from the cabin. It felt like 10 miles. The cold cut through every layer, found every gap in clothing, worked its way into bone. Ethan's face went numb. His lungs ached with each breath. Beside him, Clara stumbled but kept moving, her hand gripping his arm with surprising strength. The fence appeared out of the darkness like a ghost. Ethan followed it to the gate, wrestled it open against the wind, and pushed through. The cattle should be huddled in the lee of the hillside, where a slight overhang and thick brush provided some shelter from the worst of the weather. Should be, if any of them were still alive. The lantern light found them. 30, maybe 35 animals pressed together, their breath forming a cloud of steam that the wind tore apart and scattered. They were painfully thin, ribs showing through their winter coats, heads hanging low. Several lay in the snow, too weak to stand. Clara pulled free of his grip and moved toward the nearest animal. She knelt in the snow, seemingly oblivious to the cold, and ran her hands over the cow's body. Her movements were confident, practiced. She checked the animal's eyes, its mouth, felt along its belly and flanks. Then she moved to the next one, and the next. Ethan watched, holding the lantern high, wondering what she was seeing that he'd missed. After the 5th animal, Clara stood and turned to him. She had to shout to be heard over the wind. When did you last check their water? This morning. Broke the ice like always. Show me the trough. It was on the far side of the pasture, a long wooden structure fed by a spring that ran year-round. In summer, it was a blessing. In winter, it was one more thing that could go wrong. Ethan led the way, Clara following so close she was almost stepping on his heels. The trough was frozen over, as expected. Ethan used his boot to break through the ice. Water welled up, dark and sluggish. Clara knelt again, this time examining the water itself. She scooped some in her gloved hand, brought it close to the lantern, then dropped it and wiped her hand on her coat. "Do you have another water source?" she asked. "There's a creek on the far property line, but it's half a mile away, and in this weather, find a way." Clara stood, her face set with an expression Ethan was starting to recognize. Determination that bordered on stubbornness. "This water is contaminated. I can smell it. See that greenish tint? Algae bloom. Probably copper poisoning from the spring. It's slow, but it's killing them." Ethan stared at her, then at the water. He'd drunk from this spring himself 100 times. "That's impossible. This spring has fed this ranch for 20 years. Springs change. Mineral content shifts, especially after drought. You said the cattle started getting sick last summer?" "June, right after the first heat wave. When the water table dropped and the spring started pulling from deeper deposits." Clara was talking fast now, animated in a way she hadn't been inside the cabin. "The algae feeds on the copper. The cattle drink it, get sick slowly, stop eating because it damages their stomachs. The vet wouldn't see it unless he tested the water specifically. And why would he? The symptoms look like a dozen other things." It made a terrible kind of sense. Ethan felt something that might have been hope, might have been fury, might have been both. "So what do we do? I can't haul water half a mile for 40 head in the middle of winter." "You do it for 3 days, just 3 days. We bring them clean water, clean out their systems, start them on willow bark tea to heal the damage. Some won't make it, but the ones strong enough might recover fast. Copper poisoning is vicious, but it's not permanent if you catch it in time." 3 days? Ethan laughed, and this time there was something in it besides bitterness. "That's all I've got anyway. If the bank takes the ranch on the 28th, none of this matters." Clara looked at him across the space of snow and lantern light, 2 people standing in the middle of a blizzard, discussing impossible solutions to unsolvable problems. "Then we'd better get started." They made it back to the cabin more dead than alive. Ethan's face was so numb he couldn't feel where skin ended and cold began. His lungs burned. His legs shook with exhaustion. Clara was worse. She collapsed inside the door, and it took both of them to get her out of the frozen coat. But her eyes were bright, alive. "We need barrels," she said through chattering teeth. "Every container you have. And we start hauling water at first light." Ethan wanted to tell her she was insane, that no one could haul enough water to save 40 head of cattle in the middle of a Wyoming blizzard, that even if they could, the bank wouldn't care, that this was all pointless, doomed, a waste of the little energy they had left. He said, "I've got 3 barrels in the shed and some old milk cans." Clara nodded. "It'll have to be enough." They sat by the fire, wrapped in blankets, drinking coffee that was more heat than flavor. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, something had shifted. Ethan couldn't name it yet. Didn't want to. Naming things gave them power, made them real, and he'd learned the hard way that real things could die and leave you hollow. But Clara was looking at him like he was someone who might have a future. And for the first time in 2 years, Ethan Cole felt the smallest, most fragile stirring of belief that she might be right. "You should sleep," he said. "Tomorrow's going to be hell." "Tomorrow's going to be a beginning," Clara corrected. She stood, swaying only a little. "Thank you, Ethan, for not sending me away. For listening." Yeah, well, he didn't know how to finish that sentence. "Bedroom's through there. Should still be blankets on the bed." She paused in the doorway, turned back. "This ranch. Haven Ridge. Is that what you call it?" "No, it's just the coal place. Always has been." "It should have a better name," Clara said. "If we're going to save it." She disappeared into the bedroom before he could tell her that saving it was impossible, that hope was dangerous, that he'd given up on miracles the day Margaret's fever broke and left him alone. But the words wouldn't come anyway. Ethan sat by the fire and watched the flames dance. Outside, the storm continued its assault. Inside, a stranger slept in his dead wife's bed, dreaming of saving a ranch that was already lost. And somewhere in the space between those 2 impossible things, Ethan felt something he'd thought was gone forever. Not hope, not yet, but maybe the memory of what hope used to feel like. And in the frozen darkness of a Wyoming winter, that was enough to keep the whiskey bottle on the shelf and the fire burning through the night. Tomorrow they would haul water. Tomorrow they would fight for 40 dying animals and 3 days that wouldn't be enough. Tomorrow the world would probably prove Clara wrong and remind Ethan that some things couldn't be fixed. But tonight, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Ethan Cole went to sleep thinking about the morning instead of the grave. Dawn broke gray and merciless over a world turned white. Ethan woke to the sound of movement in the main room, the clank of metal, the scrape of wood against wood, the purposeful rhythm of someone who'd already been awake for hours. He sat up on the floor where he'd made his bed by the dying fire, his back protesting the hard boards, and tried to remember the last time another person's presence had woken him in his own home. Clara stood at the stove, her back to him, stirring something that actually smelled like food. She'd found Margaret's apron somewhere, tied it over the dress she'd worn yesterday, now brushed clean and hanging properly despite its travel wear. Her dark hair was pinned up in a simple knot, and in the morning light filtering through frost-covered windows, she looked like she belonged there, like the cabin had been waiting for her to fill the empty spaces. The thought made Ethan's chest tighten in ways he didn't want to examine. "You're up," Clara said without turning around. "Good. I need you to tell me where you keep the willow trees." Ethan pushed himself to his feet, joints cracking. "Morning to you, too." "We don't have time for pleasantries. The storm broke an hour ago. We've got maybe 6 hours of decent light, and that's if we're lucky." She finally looked at him, and her expression was all business. "The willow trees. Where?" "Down by the creek, the one that's half a mile away." "Perfect. We'll harvest bark on the first water run." She ladled something into a bowl and handed it to him. "Eat. You'll need your strength." Ethan looked down at what appeared to be actual oatmeal, cooked properly, with a pat of butter melting in the center and a drizzle of honey he'd forgotten he owned. His stomach growled so loudly it was almost embarrassing. "Where did you find—" "You had oats in the pantry, honey in the back corner behind the flour." The butter was in the cold box outside, which is genius, by the way, using the winter itself as refrigeration. Clara poured coffee that looked and smelled nothing like the punishment he'd been drinking for months. "I also found evidence of mice in the pantry, mold on half your provisions, and I'm fairly certain that ham from last night was on the verge of turning. We'll need to address that." "We'll need to address my pantry?" Ethan heard the edge in his voice and tried to soften it, failed. "You've been here one night." Clara met his gaze without flinching. "Yes. One night where I didn't die of exposure, starvation, or your cooking. Now I'm trying to make sure we both survive the next 3 days." She paused. "Unless you'd prefer to do this alone?" The challenge hung in the air between them. Ethan could tell her to leave, could hitch up the wagon and take her back to town right now, could return to the slow spiral of failure and whiskey he'd been nursing for 2 years. It would be easier, safer. No complications, no expectations, no one to witness what came next. He took a bite of oatmeal. It was perfect. Creamy, properly salted, the honey adding just enough sweetness to make it feel like someone actually cared whether he lived or died. "The willow trees are on the south bank," he said, "about 10 yards upstream from where the creek bends. You'll need an axe for the bark." Something that might have been satisfaction flickered across Clara's face. "Then we'd better get moving." They loaded the wagon in silence. 3 barrels, 4 milk cans, every bucket and pot that could hold water. Ethan hitched up Darby, the older of his 2 remaining horses, and tried not to think about how the animal's ribs showed through her winter coat. Another thing he'd failed to protect. Another responsibility slowly dying under his care. "She's beautiful," Clara said, running a hand down Darby's neck. The horse leaned into the touch like she'd been starving for gentleness. "What happened to her?" "Same thing that happened to everything else. Not enough food, not enough money to buy food, not enough sense to quit before I dragged everyone down with me." Clara's hand stilled. "Self-pity doesn't save ranches, Ethan." "Good thing we're not actually trying to save this one then. We're just keeping it alive long enough to hand the corpse over to the bank." "Is that what you think we're doing?" Clara moved to face him across Darby's back. "Because I didn't walk 9 miles through a blizzard to watch you give up. You walked 9 miles because someone lied to you. Don't make this into something it's not." "What it is," Clara said, her voice dropping low and intense, "is 3 days to prove everyone who counted you out was wrong, including yourself." She pulled herself up onto the wagon seat with surprising agility. "Now are we hauling water, or are you planning to argue about it until the bank shows up?" Ethan wanted to stay angry, wanted to hold on to the bitter certainty that nothing mattered, that effort was wasted, that hope was just another word for eventual disappointment. But Clara sat on that wagon seat like a woman preparing for battle, her chin raised and her eyes bright with something that looked dangerously close to faith. And he found his anger had nowhere to go. He climbed up beside her and took the reins. "If we die out there, I'm blaming you." "Fair enough. If we survive, you're giving me the credit." Despite everything, the cold, the impossibility, the sheer insanity of what they were about to attempt, Ethan felt his mouth twitch. Not quite a smile, but close. The ride to the creek was brutal. Snow had drifted 3 feet deep in places, and the wagon fought every yard. Darby struggled with the weight, her breath coming in clouds of steam, and twice they had to stop to dig out the wheels. Clara jumped down without being asked, wielding a shovel like she'd been born to it, working with a focused intensity that made Ethan's chest ache with something he refused to name. By the time they reached the creek, his shoulders burned and his hands had gone numb inside his gloves. Clara looked windburned and exhausted, but undefeated. She surveyed the water, running clear and fast where the current kept it from freezing, and nodded with satisfaction. "This is good, clean, we'll start filling." They worked in tandem, Ethan breaking ice to access the water, Clara managing the containers, both of them moving with the efficient desperation of people racing against time they didn't have. The barrels were heavy when full, almost impossible to lift into the wagon. They managed through sheer stubbornness and Clara's surprising strength. She might be thin, but there was nothing fragile about her. "The bark," she said when the first load was ready. "Show me the trees." The willows grew in a cluster where the creek widened, their bare branches forming a delicate net against the gray sky. Clara examined them with the same focused attention she'd given the cattle, then selected a tree and began stripping bark in careful sections. "Not too much from one tree," she explained as she worked. "You don't want to kill it, just enough for what we need." Her hands moved with practiced confidence. "My father taught me this. Willow bark for fever, for pain, for inflammation. The cattle's stomachs will be damaged from the copper. This will help them heal." "You really know what you're doing." It wasn't quite a question. Clara glanced at him, a strand of dark hair escaping her bun to whip across her face. "Did you think I was making it up? Inventing theories to feel useful?" "I don't know what I thought. I still don't know why you're doing this." She went back to harvesting bark, her movements deliberate. "Because it needs doing. Because those animals deserve better than dying from poisoned water. Because—" She stopped, started again, quieter. "Because I spent the last 3 years watching everything I built get destroyed by people who couldn't stand the idea of a woman who refused to need them. I left Philadelphia with nothing, less than nothing, and I'll be damned if I let this ranch die too, just because it's hard." There was a story there, in the tight set of her shoulders, and the careful way she wasn't looking at him. Ethan recognized it, the shape of wounds that hadn't healed, the kind that made a person run west chasing matrimonial advertisements from strangers. "What happened?" he asked. "In Philadelphia." Clara's hand stilled on the bark. For a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, "I was engaged, to a man my father approved of. Successful merchant, good family, all the right credentials." She resumed stripping bark, but her movements had lost their fluidity. 3 months before the wedding, I caught him in my father's study going through patient files, selling information about people's illnesses to business competitors who wanted leverage. When I confronted him, he laughed, said I should be grateful he was clever enough to profit from my father's work. "You called it off." "I called it off. He told everyone I'd gone hysterical, that women couldn't handle the pressure of proper marriage, that I'd always been unstable. My father believed him, or wanted to. By the time he died, my father, 6 months later, the whole city knew me as the woman who'd broken a good man's heart because she was too difficult to love." Clara's voice had gone flat, emotionless in the way of people reciting facts that still had power to wound. "His friends made sure I couldn't work as a teacher, couldn't rent rooms in any decent boarding house, couldn't exist in Philadelphia without their permission." Ethan felt anger kindle in his chest, cold, focused anger at men he'd never met, at a woman's father who should have protected her and didn't. So you left. So I left. Worked my way west doing whatever I could, taught at a school in Ohio for a while until the headmaster's wife decided I was too friendly with her husband. Worked for a veterinarian in Indiana until the town council decided a woman treating animals was unseemly. Kept moving until I ran out of places to run. She gathered the stripped bark in her arms. Then I saw the agency advertisement, and I thought, maybe somewhere far enough from everything I'd lost, I could build something new. With a stranger, on a failing ranch, in the middle of nowhere. Clara looked at him then, really looked at him, and her expression was impossible to read. With someone who might understand that starting over means accepting you can't go back, that sometimes the only way forward is to build something completely different from what you lost. The words settled between them like stones dropped in deep water. Ethan understood. Maybe too well. He'd been trying to keep this ranch exactly as it was when Margaret was alive, as if preserving her garden and sleeping on the floor instead of their bed could somehow stop time, could prevent the world from changing into something he didn't recognize. It hadn't worked. It never worked. And now here was this woman, this stranger who'd walked into his disaster and immediately started trying to fix things he'd decided were beyond repair. "The water's getting warm in the sun," Clara said, breaking the moment. "We should get back." They drove to the winter pasture with the wagon heavy beneath them, the barrels sloshing with each bump in the snow-packed road. The cattle were where they'd left them, huddled and miserable, steam rising from their bodies in the morning cold. Several hadn't moved at all. 2 were clearly dead. Clara saw them and her jaw tightened, but she didn't hesitate. "We'll need to separate those. Disease is disease. If they died from something else, we can't risk it spreading." They died from the same thing killing the others, just faster. Maybe. We check anyway. They hauled the water to a section of clean snow, away from the contaminated trough. Clara had brought clean buckets, and she filled them from the barrels with careful efficiency. Then she did something that surprised Ethan. She approached the cattle not like livestock, but like patients. Gentle. Speaking in low, soothing tones, offering water like an invitation rather than a command. The nearest cow, an old heifer that had been on the ranch since before Margaret died, lifted her head, scented the water, drank. "That's it," Clara murmured. "Clean water. Nothing in it but what should be there. That's it." One by one, the cattle came. Not all of them. The weakest couldn't or wouldn't move, but enough. Enough to make Ethan's chest tighten with something that felt dangerously like hope. "We need to get them to drink this regularly," Clara explained as she worked. "Flush their systems. The willow bark tea comes next. I'll brew it strong, add it to their evening water. But first they need to want to drink again. How long before we know if it's working? 24 hours? Maybe less? Copper poisoning affects them fast. If we caught it in time, recovery should be fast too." She moved to the next animal, her hands confident as she examined it. "This one's pregnant. See how she's carrying? We save her, we save 2. Ethan watched Clara work, watched her move between the cattle with the kind of attention he'd lost the ability to give anything. She saw them as individuals, not just assets, spoke to them like they mattered beyond their market value, treated his dying herd with more care than he'd managed to give anything, including himself, in 2 years. "You should have been a doctor," he said, "like your father." Clara didn't look up from the cow she was examining. "Women can't be doctors, not really. We can assist, we can learn, but practice? No medical school would take me. No hospital would hire me. The best I could hope for was to marry a doctor and help him in secret." She straightened, wiping her hands on Margaret's coat. "The man I was engaged to? He knew that, knew I wanted it more than anything. He said once we were married he'd help me get the education I wanted. After I found him selling patient information, I realized the only education he'd give me was in how to be properly grateful for his generosity. Son of a bitch. Yes." Clara's smile was sharp as winter wind. "But he taught me something valuable. That building on someone else's foundation means they can take it away whenever they choose. So now I build on my own terms, even if the ground is frozen and nothing wants to grow." They worked through midday, hauling more water, checking the herd, removing the dead. Clara insisted on examining the deceased animals, cutting them open with Ethan's knife, studying their organs with clinical detachment. She was right. Copper poisoning, the liver's green-tinged and damaged, the stomach lining inflamed. "At least we know," she said, washing her hands in the snow. "No mystery, just damage we can fix. If we had time. We have 3 days. Let's not waste them arguing about what we don't have." She pulled herself back onto the wagon, her movement slower now. Exhaustion was setting in. "One more load of water, then I need to brew the willow tea, and you need to eat something that isn't oatmeal from this morning." "I'm fine." "You're swaying when you stand, and your lips are blue. We're both fine until we're not, and then we're useless." Claire's voice softened, just a fraction. "I know you're used to doing everything alone, Ethan, but you don't have to anymore. Not today." Something in his chest cracked at that. Some wall he'd built so carefully he'd forgotten it was there. He wanted to tell her not to do this, not to make him believe things could be different, not to offer partnership he'd inevitably destroy through his own failures. Wanted to protect her from the disappointment of investing in something already foreclosed. Instead he said, "One more load, then we eat." They made the final trip to the creek in silence, but it was different now, companionable instead of tense. Two people working toward the same impossible goal, too tired to maintain proper distance. Clara fell asleep leaning against his shoulder on the ride back, her breath warm against his neck, and Ethan didn't wake her until they reached the pasture. By the time they returned to the cabin, the sun was low, and both of them could barely stand. Ethan unhitched Darby, gave her the last of the good hay he'd been hoarding, and stumbled inside to find Clara already at the stove. "Sit," she ordered. "I'm making actual food. You're about to fall over, so I'll cook sitting down. Sit." He sat, watched her move around the kitchen with the same focused efficiency she brought to everything. She'd found vegetables he'd forgotten about, salt pork from the cold box, and somehow turned it into stew that actually smelled like something worth eating. The willow bark tea simmered in a pot on the back of the stove, filling the cabin with a sharp medicinal scent. "Tell me about your wife," Clara said, without looking at him. The question caught Ethan off guard. "Why?" "Because this was her home, her cabin, her coat I'm wearing. I'm sleeping in her bed, cooking with her pots, and I don't even know her name." Clara turned to face him. "If I'm going to be here, even for 3 days, I should know who I'm haunting." It was such an odd way to phrase it that Ethan almost smiled. "Margaret." Her name was Margaret. He stared at his hands, rough and scarred from ranch work. "We married young, too young, everyone said, but we didn't care. Built this place from nothing. She wanted children, wanted the house full. We tried. It never happened. Then the drought came, and the fever, and—" His throat closed. "And you've been trying to keep everything exactly as it was," Clara finished quietly. "As if changing anything would mean admitting she's really gone." "Don't." The word came out harsh. "Don't psychoanalyze me like I'm one of your patients. I'm not. I'm just recognizing something I understand." Clara brought bowls of stew to the table, set one in front of him. "When my father died, I kept his medical bag for a year. Couldn't open it, couldn't get rid of it. It sat in my room like a corpse I was too afraid to bury. Finally, someone stole it from the boarding house, and I was furious. Then I was relieved, because as long as I had it, I had to keep pretending he might come back." Ethan picked up his spoon, put it down. "What made you stop?" "Pretending. Realizing that he wouldn't want me to. That the best way to honor him wasn't to preserve everything exactly as it was, but to take what he taught me and build something new with it." She sat across from him, her face tired but determined. "Margaret wouldn't want you to die with this ranch, Ethan. She'd want you to fight for it, or let it go and build something else. But not this. Not slow surrender disguised as loyalty." "You didn't know her." "No, but I know what it looks like when someone's already given up. And I watched my father do it after my mother died. He stopped caring whether his practice thrived, stopped caring if he lived or died. By the time the pneumonia took him, I think he was grateful." Claire's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Don't make me watch someone else choose that." The cabin felt very small, very quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up again, carrying the promise of more snow. Inside, two damaged people sat across a table and looked at each other like mirrors reflecting truths they'd been avoiding. 3 days, Ethan said finally. If we save the cattle in 3 days, the bank still takes the ranch. I don't have the money. There's no miracle coming. Then we work the miracle ourselves, Clara raised her bowl in a mock toast, to impossible things accomplished by people too stubborn to quit. Ethan found himself raising his own bowl, to stupidity that looks like courage. Close enough. They ate. The stew was good, actually good, not just edible. The cabin felt warm. Outside the window, the winter pasture was invisible in gathering darkness, but Ethan could picture the cattle there, drinking clean water, their systems slowly purging poison. 40 head. Maybe 30 by morning if luck ran against them. Maybe 35 if Clara's miracle had any substance. Either way, it was more than he'd had yesterday. After dinner, they hauled the willow tea out to the pasture in the last light. The cattle drank cautiously at first, suspicious of the bitter taste, but thirst and Clara's gentle persistence won out. They drank, all of them that could. And when the stars came out cold and distant overhead, Ethan stood in the snow next to a woman he barely knew and felt something he hadn't felt in so long he'd forgotten its name. Not hope, exactly. Not yet. But the space where hope might grow if given room and time and someone stubborn enough to believe in impossible things. Tomorrow, Claire said, her breath frosting in the starlight, we check for improvement, start regular water schedules. Make sure they're drinking enough to flush the poison completely. And the day after that? We prove everyone wrong about this ranch, about you, about what's possible when two people refuse to quit. She looked at him, and in the darkness her eyes caught starlight. Sound like a plan? Ethan thought about the bank deadline, about foreclosure and failure and 2 years of slow dying. Then he thought about this woman who'd walked 9 miles through a blizzard to find him, who saw problems and immediately started solving them, who treated his failures like puzzles instead of sentences. Sounds insane, he said. Clara smiled. Good. Sanity's overrated anyway. They walked back to the cabin through snow that crunched beneath their boots, and for the first time since Margaret died, Ethan didn't feel the weight of the silence trying to crush him. Clara hummed something, a melody he didn't recognize, and the sound-filled spaces he'd forgotten could hold anything besides grief. Inside, she went straight to the bedroom without being told. Ethan made his bed by the fire, but before he could settle in, Clara appeared in the doorway. "Thank you," she said, "for listening about Philadelphia, about my father. I don't usually—" She stopped. "Most people don't want to hear it. Most people are idiots." "True enough." She hesitated. "Ethan, tomorrow's going to be harder when we see which cattle made it through the night, when we count what we've lost." "I know. But we keep going anyway?" He looked at her standing in Margaret's doorway, wrapped in Margaret's shawl, asking him to believe in possibilities he'd abandoned, and found himself nodding. "Yeah," he said, "we keep going anyway." Clara smiled, a real smile this time, warm and bright and full of something that might actually be hope, and disappeared into the bedroom. Ethan lay down by this fire and stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind and the crackle of flames and the soft sounds of another person existing in his space. 3 days until the bank came. 3 days to work a miracle. 3 days with a woman who'd appeared out of a blizzard and immediately started fighting for a future he'd already surrendered. It was impossible. It was insane. It was the first thing that had made sense in longer than he could remember. Ethan closed his eyes and, for once, didn't dream of Margaret's fever or empty fields or foreclosure notices. He dreamed of cattle drinking clean water, of a woman's hands gentle on damaged things, of the possibility that maybe, just maybe, salvation didn't arrive as hope. It arrived as someone willing to work beside you when everything else had already failed. Morning arrived with the silence that felt like judgment. Ethan woke before dawn, his body trained to rancher's hours, even when there was nothing left worth ranching. He lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet cabin, the soft breathing from the bedroom that meant Clara was still asleep. Then he remembered the cattle, the water, the impossible thing they were attempting, and exhaustion evaporated into pure dread. He pulled on his boots and coat in darkness, slipped out the door before conscience could tell him he was being a coward. The walk to the winter pasture felt like walking to an execution. His execution. The moment when reality would prove Clara's optimism was just pretty words wrapped around inevitable failure. The sun was just breaking the horizon when he reached the fence, painting the snow in shades of gold and pink that seemed obscene given what he expected to find. Ethan climbed over the rails and moved toward where the herd should be, his heart hammering against his ribs. Then he stopped. The cattle were standing. Not all of them, but more than he'd dared hope. They weren't huddled in that defeated cluster anymore, weren't lying in the snow waiting to die. Several were actually moving around, pawing at the snow to reach the sparse grass underneath. The pregnant heifer Clara had pointed out yesterday stood near the clean water they'd hauled, her head up, her eyes clear. Ethan counted quickly. 32. He'd lost 8 overnight, but 32 were still breathing, still fighting, and as he watched, one of the cows that had been too weak to stand yesterday struggled to her feet, swayed, steadied herself, and took 3 trembling steps toward the water. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered, "he's got nothing to do with it." Ethan spun around to find Clara standing behind him, Margaret's coat wrapped tight against the morning cold. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and her face bore the creases of sleep, but her eyes were sharp and already cataloging the herd. "You followed me. You left before I could stop you. I figured you'd either come back or I'd find you out here doing something stupid like taking all the blame for the ones that didn't make it." She moved past him toward the cattle, her boots crunching in the snow. 32, that's better than I expected. Better than... Ethan's voice cracked. Clara, 8 died. And 32 lived. 32 that would all be dead by now if we'd done nothing. She knelt beside one of the standing cattle, ran practiced hands over its body. This one's already stronger. See how she's holding her weight? Yesterday she could barely lift her head. Now she's interested in food again. 8 died, Ethan repeated, but the words had less conviction this time. Clara stood and turned to face him, and her expression was gentle but unyielding. Yes, 8 died. Because the poisoning was too advanced, because they were already too weak, because we started too late. We can mourn them, or we can save the 32 who have a chance. Your choice. It should have felt callous. Instead, it felt like absolution, like permission to stop carrying the weight of every single failure, every loss, everything he couldn't control. Ethan looked at the standing cattle, at the ones drinking clean water, at the pregnant heifer whose calf might actually have a chance now. We saved the 32, he said. Good. Clara was already moving, checking each animal with systematic efficiency. Because they're going to need continuous clean water today. The ones that are recovering will drink more as their systems flush. We need at least 3 more loads from the creek. 3 loads, in one day. Ethan did the math in his head. The time, the effort, the toll on Darby, who was already struggling. That's necessary. Unless you have a better plan. He didn't. They both knew he didn't. So he hitched up Darby and they made the first trip to the creek while the sun was still climbing. Then the second. Then the third. By afternoon, Ethan's shoulders burned and his hands were raw despite the gloves. Clara moved like someone running on pure will, her face pale with exhaustion, but her movements never slowing. On the 4th trip, because 3 wasn't enough, would never be enough, they found someone waiting at the creek. The man was old, weathered like driftwood, sitting on a fallen log near the water with the patience of someone who'd been there a while. His horse grazed nearby, a sturdy sorrel that looked better fed than anything on Ethan's land. When he saw the wagon approach, he stood slowly, joints protesting, and waited. Tom Henderson, Ethan said, surprised. What are you doing out here? Tom Henderson owned the neighboring ranch, 3,000 acres of prime grazing land that the drought had barely touched. He'd offered to buy Ethan's property twice already, both times at prices that were insultingly low, but probably fair given the circumstances. Ethan had refused, pride mostly, and the stubborn certainty that selling to Henderson would be admitting Margaret's dream had died for nothing. Heard you had company, Henderson said, his eyes sliding to Clara with open curiosity. Thought I'd ride over, see if the rumors were true. What rumors? Clara asked before Ethan could speak. That Ethan Cole's mail-order bride walked in from town through the Christmas blizzard. That she's some kind of miracle worker who's saving his herd with nothing but creek water and stubborn determination. Henderson's smile was thin. Small valley, News travels. Ethan felt his jaw tighten. We're managing our affairs, don't need commentary. Didn't say you did, just came to see for myself. Henderson studied Clara with the assessment of a man evaluating livestock. You don't look like much of a miracle worker. Look more like someone who's about to collapse from exhaustion. Looks can be deceiving, Clara said evenly. And I'm not a miracle worker, just someone who knows sick cattle when she sees them. That's so. Henderson's interest sharpened. And what's your diagnosis, miss? Hale. Clara Hale. She didn't offer her hand. Copper poisoning from the spring water. Simple environmental contamination. We're treating it with clean water and willow bark. The herd's already showing improvement. Henderson let out a low whistle. Copper poisoning, I'll be damned. Old Sam couldn't figure it out, and he's been treating cattle for 30 years. Old Sam didn't think to check the water source. Or maybe he did and didn't want to tell Ethan his land was poisoned. Clara's voice had gone sharp. Either way, the cattle are recovering. If Mr. Cole had the time and resources, he'd have a viable herd again in a month. The emphasis on if hung in the air like accusation. Henderson heard it, and his expression shifted, became more calculated. About that, he said slowly. Ethan, I heard about your situation with the bank. Deadline's the 28th, isn't it? Don't see how that's your concern. It's my concern because I made you a fair offer 6 months ago, and you turned me down flat. Now you're 3 days from losing everything. Henderson pulled a paper from his coat pocket. But I'm a generous man. I'm willing to buy the ranch right now, today. Pay off your debt to the bank, give you enough extra to start fresh somewhere else. Ethan stared at the paper without taking it. How much? $2,000. The number landed like a punch. It was more than the bank debt. Enough to clear his name, maybe even buy a small place somewhere cheaper. Enough to stop fighting, enough to let go. That's half what this land is worth, Clara said, her voice dangerously quiet. Even in its current condition. That's the market rate for a ranch with dying cattle, poisoned water, and a foreclosure deadline. Henderson shrugged. I'm offering a clean exit. Most men would be grateful. Then most men have no spine. Clara stepped between Ethan and Henderson, and despite being a foot shorter than both of them, she suddenly seemed to take up all the space. This land isn't dying. The cattle are recovering, and the only reason Mr. Cole is in this position is because he's been dealing with circumstances beyond his control while neighbors like you circled waiting to profit from his misery. Henderson's face went red. Now you listen here. No, you listen. I don't care how things work in this valley, or who's used to getting their way, or what rumors are traveling. What I care about is that you're trying to buy a ranch worth $4,000 for half price from a man in a desperate situation. That's not business. That's theft, dressed up in polite words. Clara, Ethan said quietly. He wanted to let her fight this battle, wanted to hide behind her righteous anger and let someone else handle the weight of decision. But this was his land, his failure, his choice. It's all right. It's not all right. She turned to him, and her eyes were blazing. Tell me you're not actually considering this. Tell me we didn't haul water all day, didn't save 32 head of cattle, didn't prove the ranch could recover just so you could sell it to him for pennies on the dollar. We did all that to keep them alive for 3 more days, Ethan said, and heard how defeated he sounded. The bank doesn't care about recovered cattle. They care about money I don't have. Then we find the money. There is no money to find. There's always money. We just have to... Clara stopped, her mind visibly working. The cattle. How much are they worth, the healthy ones? Ethan did quick math. 32 head at current prices, maybe 1,500. If I could get them to market, which I can't because they need another month of recovery, and I've got 3 days. What if they were healthier? What if we could prove they're disease-free, recovering, worth buying? Clara, there's no market. Not here. Not in 3 days. She spun to Henderson. You need cattle for your ranch? I assume that's part of why you want this land. Henderson looked wary. What are you proposing? The herd, all 32 head. We sell them to you today at fair market value. That gives Ethan the money to pay off the bank, keep his land, and time to rebuild properly. Those cattle are sick, Henderson pointed out. Those cattle are recovering from environmental poisoning that won't affect them once they're on different land with different water. You can verify that yourself. Bring your own veterinarian, Or don't, and buy the whole ranch for half price like you planned. Your choice. Ethan watched Henderson's face as he calculated. The old rancher wasn't stupid. He knew Clara was right about the cattle, knew that 32 head of recovered stock was worth more than the 2,000 he'd offered for the land. But he also knew Ethan was desperate, knew the bank wouldn't wait, knew time was the one commodity they didn't have. $1,000, Henderson said finally. For the herd. And that's generous considering the risk. 1,800, Clara countered without hesitation. And you know it is. These are good animals from good breeding stock. Once they're recovered, they're worth twice that. 1,200. Final offer. 1,700, and we deliver them to your property once they're strong enough to move. 2 weeks? Maybe less. Henderson studied her for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he laughed. You've got brass, I'll give you that. 1,600. Cash. And you deliver them in 10 days or the deal's void. Clara looked at Ethan. Your cattle. Your decision. $1,600. It wasn't enough to pay the bank and have anything left over. Wasn't enough to buy feed for winter or fix the collapsed barn or repair the fences that needed mending. But it was enough to stop the foreclosure. Enough to buy time. Enough to mean they hadn't failed completely. 1,700, Ethan heard himself say. And you give us 12 days for delivery. Some of these animals need more recovery time than 10 days allows. Henderson's eyebrows rose. Then he grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. 1,700, 12 days. But if they're not recovered enough to make the journey, the price drops to 1,500. Done. Ethan stuck out his hand before he could second-guess himself. Henderson shook it, his grip strong and calloused. I'll have Sam come check them tomorrow. Verify they're recovering like your bride says. Henderson tipped his hat to Clara. You're wasted on him, miss. If you ever get tired of hauling water for a losing operation, my ranch could use someone with your fire. Your ranch could use someone who's not afraid to tell you when you're being a vulture, Clara replied sweetly. But I appreciate the offer. Henderson laughed again and mounted his horse. 12 days, Ethan. Don't make me regret this. He rode off, leaving them standing by the creek in the weakening afternoon light. Ethan waited until Henderson was out of sight. Then he turned to Clara. What the hell just happened? We bought you time and probably kept you from making the worst business decision of your life. She was shaking, fine tremors running through her hands. Adrenaline crash, Ethan realized. She'd been running on fury and desperation, and now that Henderson was gone, her body was catching up with what she'd just done. Sit down, he said, guiding her to the log Henderson had vacated. Before you fall down. I'm fine. You're shaking like a leaf. Sit. Clara sat, wrapped her arms around herself. Did I overstep? I shouldn't have. I had no right to negotiate for your cattle without asking first. I just saw him, and I knew what he was doing, and I couldn't. She stopped, took a breath. I'm sorry. For what? For saving my ranch? For getting fair value instead of letting me sell out for half of nothing? Ethan sat beside her, their shoulders almost touching. Clara, you just did in 5 minutes what I've been failing to do for 2 years. The only thing you should be sorry for is not showing up sooner. $1,700 won't solve everything. No, but it solves the immediate problem. Keeps the bank off my back long enough to figure out the next steps. He looked at her profile, the determined set of her jaw even in exhaustion. Where did you learn to negotiate like that? Philadelphia, my father's practice. Insurance companies, hospitals, patients who couldn't pay. You learn to fight for fair value when everyone's trying to cheat you. Clara's mouth twisted. And after my engagement ended, I learned that the only person who'd fight for me was me. So I got good at it. You're more than good. You're terrifying. Thank you. She turned to look at him, and despite the exhaustion, her eyes were bright. So what now? We have 12 days to get 32 head of cattle healthy enough for delivery. That's completely insane and possibly impossible, Ethan finished. But we've been doing impossible things for 2 days already. What's 12 more? Clara smiled, and it transformed her tired face into something radiant. Exactly what I was thinking. They made one more water run before dark, then returned to the cabin in a silence that felt comfortable instead of heavy. Clara disappeared into the bedroom to change while Ethan started a fire and tried to process what had happened. In 2 days, this woman had diagnosed his herd, negotiated a business deal, and given him something he'd thought was gone forever. A future. Fragile and uncertain, but real. "Ethan?" Clara's voice came from the bedroom, odd and strained. "Can you come here?" He found her standing in the middle of the room, holding one of Margaret's dresses. It was blue calico, faded but still beautiful, the one Margaret had worn to town on Sundays. Clara's face was pale. "I was looking for something clean to wear. The dress I came in needs washing, and I don't have—" She stopped. "I shouldn't have gone through her things. I'm sorry. I'll put it back." "It's fine." The words came out automatically. Then, because they were true, she'd want someone to use them. No point in them sitting in a trunk forever. Clara set the dress down carefully, like it might break. "Tell me about her. Really tell me. Not just that she died, but who she was." Ethan leaned against the doorframe, suddenly exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with hauling water. She was stubborn, funny, had this laugh that could fill a whole room. She grew vegetables that shouldn't have survived in Wyoming soil and somehow made them thrive anyway. His throat closed. "She sounds wonderful," Clara said softly. She was. And I failed her. The ranch, the cattle, all of it. She believed I could make it work, and I couldn't. By the time she got sick, we were already losing ground. I think maybe— The words were acid in his mouth. I think maybe the stress of watching everything fall apart made her more vulnerable. Maybe if I'd been stronger, better at this, she would have survived. Or maybe she got sick because fever doesn't care about ranch management. Clara crossed the room to stand in front of him. "Ethan, you can't blame yourself for a disease, any more than you can blame yourself for drought, or bad feed, or poisoned water. I can blame myself for giving up after, for letting everything she built rot away because I didn't care enough to save it. But you're saving it now. With me. Maybe that's what she would have wanted, for you to find someone who could help you see the ranch the way she did. Worth fighting for." The words hung between them, heavy with implication neither of them was ready to examine. Ethan looked at Clara in the fading light, this stranger who'd walked into his disaster and refused to let him drown in it, and felt something shift in his chest, something dangerous that felt like the beginning of belief. "Keep the dress," he said. "Wear whatever you need. She'd like that better than having it locked away." Clara's eyes shimmered with tears she didn't let fall. "Thank you." They ate dinner in comfortable silence, bread and cheese and the last of the ham, simple food that tasted better than it should because they were sharing it. Afterward, Clara brewed more willow bark tea while Ethan cleaned the dishes properly for the first time in months. Outside, the temperature dropped and the wind picked up, but inside the cabin felt warm, lived in, like a home instead of a mausoleum. "Tomorrow," Clara said, wrapping her hands around a cup of coffee, "Henderson's veterinarian comes. We need the cattle looking as healthy as possible. They'll either be recovered or they won't. Can't fake that." "No, but we can present them well. Clean water, good spacing, the stronger ones up front where he'll see them first. First impressions matter in business. If Sam sees thriving cattle, he'll report that. If he sees the sickest ones first, Henderson might try to renegotiate." Ethan found himself smiling. "You've thought of everything." "Not everything. I'm still figuring out how we'll get them to Henderson's ranch in 12 days. Some of the weaker ones won't be ready to walk that far. We'll use the wagon. Make multiple trips if we have to." The wagon's barely holding together. "And Darby?" Clara stopped. "She's struggling. I noticed today. We're pushing her too hard. We don't have a choice. We always have choices. We just don't always like them." Clara set down her cup. "What if we asked for help? Your other neighbors, surely someone— No one's going to help a failing rancher they've already written off. This valley, you help people on their way up. Once you're falling, you get out of the way or get trampled. That's a terrible philosophy. That's survival." Ethan heard the bitterness in his voice and tried to soften it. "Besides, I don't want charity. We do this ourselves, or not at all." Clara looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Pride is expensive, Ethan. sometimes more expensive than we can afford. Speaking from experience? Always. She stood, gathering dishes. But I also know that asking for help isn't weakness, it's strategy. Something to think about when we're trying to move 32 head of cattle with one exhausted horse and two people who can barely stand. She was right. Ethan knew she was right. But the thought of going to neighbors who'd watched him fail, asking for assistance they'd probably refuse, made his skin crawl with humiliation he wasn't ready to face. "We'll manage," he said instead. Clara didn't argue, just washed the dishes in silence while Ethan pretended not to notice the disappointed set of her shoulders. When everything was clean, she said goodnight and disappeared into the bedroom, leaving him alone with the fire and his thoughts. Ethan lay down on his bedroll and stared at the ceiling. 2 days ago, he'd been ready to let the bank take everything. Now he was planning how to deliver cattle in 12 days, how to rebuild with nothing but stubborn determination and a woman who believed impossible things were worth attempting. It should have felt overwhelming. Instead, it felt like the first real breath he'd taken in 2 years. From the bedroom, Clara's voice drifted soft through the door. "Ethan? Yeah? Thank you for letting me stay, for letting me help. I know I complicate everything." "You saved everything," he corrected. "There's a difference." Silence. Then, "We saved it. Together. Together." The words settled into Ethan's chest like something taking root. He'd been alone so long he'd forgotten what together felt like. Forgotten that burdens were lighter when shared, that impossible tasks became possible when two people refused to quit. "Yeah," he said into the darkness. "Together." He fell asleep to the sound of wind and crackling fire and Clara's soft breathing from the next room, and dreamed not of failure or foreclosure, but of 32 head of cattle walking healthy across his land, of a ranch restored, of a future built on faith and stubbornness, and the miracle of someone who'd refused to let him surrender. Morning would bring Henderson's veterinarian, would bring judgment and assessment, and the possibility that everything they'd done wasn't enough. But tonight, in the warm cabin with someone who believed in him sleeping one room away, Ethan Cole allowed himself to hope. And hope, fragile and new as it was, felt like the most dangerous thing he'd ever dared to hold. Sam Winters arrived at noon with the kind of skepticism that came from 30 years of seeing ranchers lie about their livestock's condition. Ethan spotted him riding up the valley road, a compact figure on a rangy buckskin, his medical bag tied behind the saddle. Clara saw him too and immediately began arranging the cattle, moving the strongest ones forward, spacing them so the weaker animals weren't as obvious. It was theater, Ethan knew, but effective theater. "You didn't tell me you were this calculating," he said, watching her work. "I'm not calculating, I'm strategic. There's a difference." She positioned the pregnant heifer near the front, where her obvious improvement would be impossible to miss. "Everything I'm showing him is true. I'm just controlling what he sees first." Sam dismounted slowly, his weathered face revealing nothing as he surveyed the pasture. He was old enough that retirement should have been tempting, but ranchers didn't retire until they died or their bodies gave out. His eyes were sharp, though, missing nothing as they swept across the herd. "Sam," Ethan said, extending his hand. "Ethan." "Miss." Sam nodded to Clara, his gaze lingering on her with open curiosity. "Henderson said you've been treating copper poisoning. That true?" "It's true," Clara replied. "From the spring water. I can show you the contaminated source if you'd like verification." "I'd like to see the cattle first. Henderson says you're claiming miraculous recovery in 3 days. That's not how copper poisoning works." "Nothing miraculous about it. Just clean water, willow bark tea, and animals that weren't as far gone as they appeared." Clara gestured to the nearest cow. "This one was barely standing 2 days ago. Check her eyes, her coat, her general condition. Then tell me she's not recovering." Sam approached the animal with the cautious respect of someone who'd been kicked by enough cattle to know better than to trust them. He ran his hands over the cow's body, checked her gums, her eyes, felt along her belly and flanks. His expression remained neutral, but Ethan saw the moment surprise flickered across his features. "She's stronger than I expected," Sam admitted. "Still thin, but alert, interested in food." He moved to the next animal, then the next, his examination thorough and professional. The pregnant heifer got extra attention, and when he finished, he stood back and rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "You did this?" he asked Clara. "Diagnosed and treated 32 head in 3 days?" "Mr. Cole and I did it together, though the diagnosis was straightforward once I checked the water source. The treatment is just basic medical knowledge applied to livestock." "Basic medical knowledge most vets miss, huh?" Sam's tone held grudging respect. "I looked at these cattle 6 months ago, told Ethan it was likely bad feed or general failure to thrive. Never thought to test the water. That's on me." "The drought changed the water table," Clara said, her voice gentler now. "No one could have predicted the spring would pull from copper deposits. It's not your fault you missed it." Sam looked at her for a long moment. "You're kinder than I deserve. Henderson said you were sharp as a knife. Didn't mention you were fair about it." He turned to Ethan. "These cattle are recovering, not all the way there yet, but showing genuine improvement. I'll tell Henderson the herd's worth what you're asking, but—" He paused. "Some of these won't be ready to move in 12 days, maybe the strongest 15-20 head. The rest need more time." Ethan felt his stomach drop. If they could only deliver part of the herd, Henderson would renegotiate the price down. They'd be back where they started, scrambling for money that didn't exist. 25, Clara said firmly. "We can have 25 ready in 12 days if we continue treatment properly. The weakest 7 stay here to recover fully, and we deliver them separately once they're strong enough. Henderson gets his full herd just in 2 batches instead of 1. Henderson won't like that. Henderson doesn't have to like it. He just has to accept it. The contract we agreed to says delivery in 12 days. It doesn't specify that all animals must be delivered simultaneously." Clara's smile was sharp. "Unless Mr. Henderson wants to renegotiate the entire deal, he'll accept staged delivery." Sam actually laughed. "You remind me of my late wife. She could argue a rock into believing it was water." He gathered his horse's reins. "I'll tell Henderson what I saw. The cattle are recovering, the diagnosis is sound, and staged delivery is reasonable given the circumstances. Whether he accepts it is his problem, not yours." After Sam rode off, Ethan turned to Clara. "You just invented a 2-stage delivery contract that doesn't exist." "I invented a reasonable solution to an unreasonable timeline. There's a difference." She was already walking toward the cattle, her mind clearly moving to the next problem. "We need to identify which 25 are strongest. Start giving them extra rations if we have any. Build their strength for the journey." "We don't have extra rations. We barely have regular rations." Clara stopped walking, turned to face him. "Then we go to town. Buy feed. Use some of Henderson's advance payment." "We don't have Henderson's advance payment yet. He hasn't agreed to the stage delivery." "He will, because the alternative is losing a fair deal over stubbornness." She crossed her arms. "Ethan, we're going to need supplies regardless. Feed, better rope for leading the cattle, maybe another horse to help with transport. We can't do this with nothing. We've been doing everything with nothing so far." "Yes, and we're both exhausted, Darby's half dead, and we're one injury or illness away from complete failure." "That's not sustainability. That's desperation on borrowed time." Clara's voice softened. "I know asking for credit feels like admitting weakness, but the general store in town must know you. Your family's been here for years. Surely they'd extend—" "They'd extend nothing," Ethan cut her off. "I already owe Morrison at the general store $200 from last year. He made it clear last time I was there that my credit was gone until I paid him back." Silence fell between them. Clara's expression shifted from determination to something harder to read. Finally, she said, "Then I'll go to town. Talk to Morrison myself." "And say what? That you're my mail-order bride who's been here 3 days and needs him to trust you with credit he already refused me? No. I'll say I'm a woman with medical training who's successfully treating a herd that 3 veterinarians said was doomed, and that I'm offering him first chance to invest in a recovering operation before other merchants realize what's happening." Clara's chin lifted. "People respond to competence and opportunity. If I can show him that this ranch is turning around, that there's profit to be made in supporting it, he might listen, or he might laugh you out of his store. Maybe. But sitting here arguing about it won't feed those cattle or get them ready for delivery." She started toward the cabin. "I'm going to town. You can come with me or you can stay and work the herd. Your choice." Ethan watched her march away, her spine straight despite obvious exhaustion, and felt something between admiration and terror. This woman had walked into his life 3 days ago and was now planning to march into town and negotiate credit from a man who'd already written Ethan off as a bad investment. It was insane. It would probably fail, but it was the only plan they had. "Wait," he called after her. "If you're going to Morrison's, there's something you should know about him." Clara stopped, turned. "I'm listening." "He's not just stubborn about money. His daughter was sick last winter. Consumption. I heard she was getting worse." Ethan remembered the whispers in town, the way people had talked about Mary Morrison's failing health. "If you've got medical knowledge, if you can offer to help her, you want me to use a sick girl as leverage for feed credit?" Claire's voice had gone cold. "No. I want you to offer help because you can help. And maybe in return, Morrison sees that having you around benefits more than just my ranch." Ethan met her gaze. "You said people respond to competence and opportunity. That's both." Clara studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I'll need to know her symptoms. Everything you remember people saying." They rode to town in the wagon, Darby pulling with visible effort. The road was clearer now, the storm's snow packed down by traffic, but it was still slow going. Clara sat beside Ethan in silence, and he could practically hear her mind working, planning, strategizing. "Tell me about this town," she said finally. "The people, what I'm walking into." "Small, maybe 200 people. Everyone knows everyone's business, and most of them have decided my business is failing." Ethan kept his eyes on the road. "Morrison runs the general store. His wife died 5 years ago, and he's been raising Mary alone. She's 16, 17 maybe. Smart girl. Used to help in the store before she got sick." "And the consumption?" "Started last spring, coughing, weight loss. Doc Patterson from the next valley over said there wasn't much to be done. Keep her comfortable, pray for a miracle." Clara made a sound of frustration. "Consumption isn't one disease. It's a symptom cluster that can mean a dozen different things. Without examining her, I can't—" She stopped. "But if I can offer something Patterson missed, Morrison might listen." The town appeared over the next rise, a cluster of wooden buildings arranged along a single main street. The general store anchored one end, the saloon the other, with a church, a few houses, and the bank filling the space between. It looked exactly like what it was, a frontier town barely holding on, sustained by the ranches surrounding it and the desperate hope that the railroad might someday come through. Ethan pulled the wagon up in front of Morrison's general store and felt every eye on the street turn to watch. News of Clara had clearly spread faster than he'd anticipated. 2 women stopped their conversation to stare. A man smoking outside the saloon actually crossed the street for a better view. "They're all looking at us," Clara observed. "They're looking at you." The crazy woman who walked through a blizzard to marry a failing rancher. Ethan climbed down, offered his hand to help Clara descend. "Welcome to small-town hospitality." The general store was warm and smelled of coffee, leather, and the peculiar mix of goods that defined frontier commerce. Morrison stood behind the counter, a solid man with gray hair and the permanently tired expression of someone carrying too many burdens. He looked up when they entered, and his face went carefully neutral. "Ethan, didn't expect to see you. Need to make a purchase, and to introduce—" "Clara Hale," Clara said, stepping forward with her hand extended. "I'm staying at Mr. Cole's ranch. You must be Mr. Morrison." Morrison shook her hand slowly. "Heard about you. Heard you walked in from the storm. That true?" "It's true. Also heard your daughter's been ill. I have some medical training. If you'd like, I could examine her. No charge, no obligation. Just one person trying to help another." The offer hung in the air. Morrison's expression flickered through surprise, suspicion, and something that might have been desperate hope before settling back into careful neutrality. "Doc Patterson already said there's nothing to be done." Doc Patterson might be right, but a second opinion never hurts, and I've studied with doctors who specialized in respiratory illnesses. Claire's voice was gentle but confident. "At worst, I confirm what Patterson said. At best, I notice something he missed. Either way, you lose nothing by letting me try." Morrison's jaw worked. Behind him, a door opened and a thin girl appeared. Mary Morrison, Ethan assumed. She was pale as paper, dark circles under her eyes, and she moved with the careful slowness of someone rationing energy. When she coughed, it was wet and painful. "Pa, who's—" She stopped when she saw Clara. "Oh, you're the bride everyone's talking about. I'm Clara, and you must be Mary." Clara moved closer, her entire demeanor shifting into something clinical and focused. "How long have you been coughing like that?" "Since April. Gets worse at night." Mary spoke carefully, like the words cost her. "Doc Patterson says my lungs are filling, says it's just a matter of time." "May I examine you? Just a few questions and a quick look. I promise to be gentle." Mary glanced at her father. Morrison hesitated, then nodded once. Clara guided Mary to a chair near the window where the light was better, and began an examination that was both thorough and remarkably gentle. She asked questions about the cough, about breathing, about pain and fatigue. She listened to Mary's chest, checked her pulse, examined her skin and eyes. After 10 minutes, Clara sat back. "Mr. Morrison, when did Mary start working in the back storage room?" Morrison frowned. "Last fall." "Why?" "Does the storage room have water damage? Mold on the walls or ceiling?" "Some. From the roof leak last summer. I've been meaning to fix it, but—" Morrison stopped. "You think mold is causing this?" "I think Mary's symptoms are consistent with chronic mold exposure, not consumption. The wet cough, the nighttime worsening when she's sleeping in a room near the affected area, the way it started after she began spending time in that storage room." Clara stood. "It's not tuberculosis. It's environmental poisoning, similar to what happened with Mr. Cole's cattle. If you clean the mold, move Mary to a different room away from the source, and treat the lung inflammation, she should recover." Morrison stared at Clara like she'd just spoken a foreign language. "You're saying she's not dying?" "I'm saying she doesn't have consumption. The treatment is different, but the prognosis is much better. She'll need to avoid the mold completely, and I can make a tincture to help clear her lungs, but yes, she should recover." Mary started crying, not sad tears, but the kind that came from relief too overwhelming to contain. Morrison's eyes went bright and wet, and he turned away quickly, his shoulders shaking. Ethan stood by the door and watched Clara offer hope to people who'd run out of it, the same way she'd offered it to him 3 days ago. And he understood suddenly why she'd walked 9 miles through a blizzard. Not because she was desperate, because she was built to heal broken things, and staying in Philadelphia where people had decided she couldn't meant dying slowly from disuse of the only gift that mattered. When Morrison finally turned back, his voice was rough. "What do you need?" "To make this tincture." "Herbs I can gather, mostly. Mullein, elecampane if you have it, maybe some licorice root. And Mary needs to sleep in a clean, dry room as far from that storage area as possible." "She can have my room. I'll take the storage space, mold and all." Morrison wiped his eyes. "What else?" "For your ranch. Ethan said you needed supplies." Clara glanced at Ethan. "We need feed for cattle. Enough for 25 head for 2 weeks. Good quality, nothing spoiled. And some additional rope, maybe a second horse if you know anyone selling." Morrison pulled out his ledger. "The feed I can do. Put it on credit, pay me back when Henderson settles up for the herd. The horse, Tom Jenkins has a mare he's been trying to sell. Good animal. I'll send word you're interested." He looked at Ethan. "Your old debt, we'll call it even. Consider it payment for saving Mary." "Mr. Morrison, that's not—" Clara started. "That's my offer. Take it or leave it." Morrison's voice was firm. "You saved my daughter. $200 doesn't begin to cover what that's worth, but it's what I can give right now." Ethan felt something crack open in his chest. Pride, maybe, or the certainty that charity was weakness. Morrison wasn't offering charity. He was offering exchange, value for value, help for help, the way neighbors should work when they weren't too busy protecting themselves from each other's failures. "We'll take it," Ethan said, "and thank you." They left the store an hour later with promises of feed delivery by tomorrow and a list of herbs for Clara to gather. The whole town had heard by now, saw Mary Morrison walking around the store without coughing, saw her father smiling for the first time in months, saw Clara Hale working miracles with nothing but observation and knowledge. The woman who'd been watching earlier approached as they climbed back into the wagon. "Miss Hale? I'm Sarah Garrett. My son has been running a fever for 3 days. Doc Patterson's out of town. Could you? Of course, Clara said without hesitation. Let me see him. One examination led to another. A child with fever turned out to have an infected tooth. An elderly man's failing eyesight was actually cataracts that could be managed with better light and close work restriction. A woman's mysterious stomach pains were revealed as simple lactose intolerance once Clara asked about her diet. By the time they left town, the sun was setting and Clara looked ready to collapse. But she also looked alive in a way Ethan hadn't seen before, energized by the work, by the chance to use skills she'd been told were worthless. "You're going to make me into a medical clinic," Ethan observed as they drove home. "Would that be so terrible? People need help. I can provide it." Clara leaned against his shoulder, too tired to maintain proper distance. "And it builds goodwill, makes people invested in the ranch's success. When neighbors benefit from your presence, they're more likely to help when you need it. That's very calculated for someone who claims not to be calculating. I prefer to think of it as mutually beneficial strategy." She yawned. "How much feed did Morrison promise?" "Enough for 2 weeks, more if we need it." "And the horse?" "We'll see tomorrow. Jenkins' mare might be too expensive. Or might be exactly what we need." Claire's eyes drifted closed. 12 days, Ethan. We can do this in 12 days. He wanted to believe her, wanted to let himself trust that 12 days would be enough, that Henderson would accept the staged delivery, that the feed would arrive and the cattle would strengthen and the impossible deadline would somehow become possible. Instead, he said, "Get some rest. Tomorrow we sort the herd and start building strength in the ones we're moving first." Clara murmured agreement and fell asleep against his shoulder. Ethan drove them home through gathering darkness, feeling the weight of her trust and the terror of failing it. 3 days ago, he'd been alone with a bottle and a foreclosure notice. Now he had a sleeping woman pressed against his side, a town that had started believing in him again, and a deadline that would either save everything or destroy the fragile hope they'd built. When they reached the cabin, he carried Clara inside. She barely stirred, and laid her on the bed, still wearing Margaret's dress. He pulled a blanket over her and stood for a moment, watching her sleep with the kind of peace he'd forgotten existed. Then he went back outside to check the cattle one last time. The herd was quiet under the stars, 32 animals that represented everything: his last chance, Clara's faith, the difference between survival and surrender. The pregnant heifer looked up when he approached, her eyes clear and calm. "You've got to make it," Ethan told her quietly. "All of you. Because I don't know what happens if you don't." The heifer went back to grazing. Ethan stood in the cold and let himself feel the full weight of what they were attempting. 12 days to move 25 head of recovering cattle to Henderson's ranch. 12 days to prove the ranch was viable. 12 days to become someone worthy of the faith Clara kept placing in him. It should have felt impossible. 3 days ago, it would have felt impossible. But Clara had walked 9 miles through a blizzard and lived. Had diagnosed copper poisoning in an afternoon. Had negotiated with Henderson and won. Had saved Mary Morrison with a 15-minute examination. If she could do all that, maybe, just maybe, they could survive 12 more days. Ethan went back to the cabin, banked the fire, and lay down on his bedroll. From the bedroom, Clara's soft breathing was barely audible. He closed his eyes and let the sound anchor him, let it remind him that he wasn't alone anymore, that impossible things sometimes happened when two broken people decided to build something together. Tomorrow would bring challenges he couldn't predict. But tonight, in a warm cabin with a woman who believed in miracles sleeping one room away, Ethan Cole let himself believe too. And belief, fragile and terrifying as it was, felt like the strongest foundation he'd ever built on. The feed arrived at dawn on the 7th day, delivered by Morrison himself in a wagon driven by his daughter. Mary Morrison looked like a different person than the girl Ethan had seen in the store. Color had returned to her cheeks, and though she still moved carefully, the desperate fragility was gone. She helped her father unload the sacks of quality oats and hay with steady hands, and when Clara came out to greet them, Mary threw her arms around her in a hug that spoke volumes. "Pa cleaned the storage room," Mary said, her voice stronger now. "Ripped out all the moldy boards and replaced them, and the tincture you made. I can breathe again, really breathe." Clara returned the embrace, and Ethan saw her blink back tears. "I'm so glad." Keep taking the tincture for another week, and stay away from damp spaces. Your lungs need time to fully heal." Morrison shook Ethan's hand with a grip that conveyed what words couldn't. "Tom Jenkins is coming by this afternoon with that mare. Says, if you can pay half now and half when Henderson settles up, she's yours. Good animal, strong. She'll help with the cattle drive." After they left, Clara and Ethan stood looking at the stack of feed like it was treasure, which in a way it was. Survival measured in oats and hay, in the kindness of a father whose daughter could breathe again. 7 days left, Clara said. "We need to start separating the herd today. 25 strongest for delivery, 7 to stay and recover." They worked through the morning, Clara examining each animal with the same focused attention she'd given Mary Morrison, determining which were strong enough for the journey and which needed more time. The pregnant heifer made the cut. She'd recovered remarkably well, and Clara insisted that getting her to Henderson's ranch where she'd have better shelter for calving was worth the risk of moving her. By afternoon, when Tom Jenkins arrived with the mare, they had the herd divided. The mare was a beautiful buckskin, young and strong, exactly what they needed. Jenkins quoted a price that made Ethan wince, but Clara negotiated it down to something manageable, promising Jenkins free medical consultations for his family in exchange for the reduced rate. "You're going to turn this ranch into a hospital," Ethan said after Jenkins left, watching Clara run approving hands over their new horse. "I'm turning this ranch into a community. There's a difference." She looked at him over the mare's back, her expression serious. "People have been watching you fail for 2 years, Ethan. Not because they wanted you to, but because you wouldn't let anyone help. Now they're seeing what happens when you open that door, when you let people invest in your success." "I didn't open the door. You kicked it down." "Same result." Clara smiled. "What should we name her?" Ethan studied the mare, strong, steady, arrived exactly when they needed her most. "Hope," he said, surprising himself. Clara's smile widened. Perfect. The next 5 days blurred into a rhythm of relentless work. They fed the 25 cattle extra rations, building their strength for the journey. They practiced moving them in groups, teaching them to follow Hope and Darby, getting them accustomed to longer walks. Clara continued treating them with willow bark tea, monitoring their recovery with the precision of a surgeon. Word spread through the valley about what was happening at the coal ranch. Neighbors started stopping by, some offering help, others just curious to see the miracle worker who'd saved Mary Morrison and diagnosed copper poisoning that had stumped every veterinarian. Clara treated them all with the same focused attention, diagnosing ailments, offering remedies, building a network of goodwill that transformed how people saw Ethan's land. Sarah Garrett brought her son back 3 days after Clara had identified his infected tooth, reporting that the simple salt rinses Clara had recommended had cleared the infection completely. She also brought fresh bread and an offer to help with the cattle drive if they needed extra hands. The elderly man with cataracts, John Brennan, arrived with his grandson and 2 strong horses, saying he owed Clara for giving him hope he'd see another spring clearly. He offered the horses for the drive without charge. Even Henderson stopped by on the 10th day, ostensibly to check on the herd's progress. He found Ethan and Clara in the winter pasture, the 25 cattle looking remarkably healthy, the 7 staying behind showing steady improvement. "I'll be damned," Henderson said, walking among the animals. "They actually recovered. Sam said you'd done it, but I didn't quite believe him." "We did it," Ethan corrected. Clara diagnosed it. "We treated it together." Henderson studied Clara with open reassessment. "I underestimated you, Miss Hale. Thought you were just another desperate woman chasing a bad marriage prospect. Turns out you're smarter than half the men in this valley." "Only half?" Clara's eyebrow arched. Henderson actually laughed. "Fair point. Listen, about the delivery timeline. Sam told me you wanted staged delivery. 25 now, 7 later. I'm willing to accept that. Full payment when you deliver the 25 with the understanding the remaining 7 come when they're ready. No penalty, no price reduction." Ethan felt tension he didn't know he'd been carrying released from his shoulders. "That's generous. That's business. You've got good stock that was poorly managed due to circumstances beyond your control. Now it's well managed again, and I want the full herd at full strength." Henderson tipped his hat to Clara. "And Miss Hale? If you ever decide ranch life isn't for you, I meant what I said. My operation could use someone with your skills. After Henderson left, Clara turned to Ethan with barely contained excitement. Did you hear that? Full payment on delivery. No penalties. We did it, Ethan. We actually did it. We haven't delivered them yet. Details. She was practically vibrating with energy. 2 more days of preparation. Then we move them. It's 12 miles to Henderson's ranch. With Hope and Darby and the horses Brennan's lending us, we can make it in 1 day if we start early. And if something goes wrong, if one of them falters halfway there, Clara's expression sobered. Then we adapt. We've been adapting from the beginning. Why stop now? The night before the drive, they sat on the cabin's porch watching the sun set over the valley. The temperature had dropped, bringing the clean cold that meant clear weather for travel. Inside, the cabin was stocked with Morrison's feed, warm from a fire Clara had built, smelling of the stew she'd made for dinner. It felt, Ethan realized, like a home again. Not Margaret's home frozen in time, but something new built on its foundation. Tell me something, Clara said quietly. When you wrote to that matrimonial agency 3 years ago, what did you tell them you were looking for? Ethan thought back to that night, drunk and desperate and so lonely he couldn't stand it. I don't remember exactly. Someone capable. Someone who wouldn't quit when things got hard. Someone who wanted to build something instead of just maintain it. And did you get what you asked for? He looked at her in the fading light. This woman who'd walked 9 miles through a blizzard, who'd saved his cattle in half the town, who'd negotiated with Henderson and won, who'd refused to let him surrender even when surrender seemed like the only option. I got more than I deserved. Clara turned to face him fully. Ethan, I need to tell you something about why I really came here. His chest tightened. All right, but that letter from the agency, the one saying you'd confirmed the arrangement and paid my passage, I knew it seemed strange. The timing was off, the phrasing was wrong, but I came anyway because... She stopped, started again. Because I was running out of options, and because some part of me wanted to believe someone actually wanted me, wanted what I could offer. Someone forged that letter, Ethan said. We still don't know who. I think we do, or I do anyway. Clara's voice was steady. Morrison told me yesterday that his late wife was friends with your Margaret, that they'd talked about how worried she was about you after she died, about how she'd made Morrison's wife promise to find someone to help you if anything happened to her. Understanding dawned slowly. Morrison sent you. Morrison, or his wife before she passed. One of them contacted the agency, paid my passage, forged the letter, because Margaret asked them to make sure you weren't alone. Clara's eyes shimmered. I'm not really your mail-order bride, Ethan. I'm a promise someone made to a dying woman. Ethan should have felt betrayed. Manipulated. Instead, he felt something break open in his chest that had been locked since Margaret's fever took her. She would have liked you, he said, his voice rough. Margaret, she would have approved of everything you've done here. Would she have approved of this? Clara asked softly. Of me falling in love with her husband? The words hung between them in the gathering dark. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs. Clara, I'm not asking for anything, she said quickly. I know this started as a business arrangement that wasn't even real. I know you loved your wife. I know I'm just the stranger who showed up and complicated everything. But I needed to tell you before tomorrow, before we deliver the cattle and settle with the bank, and you have to decide what comes next. What comes next? Ethan repeated. He stood, pulled Clara to her feet, and looked into her eyes. What comes next is we deliver 25 head of cattle to Henderson. We pay off the bank. We use the remaining money to fix the barn and repair the fences and buy breeding stock for spring. We keep treating people who need medical help because you're brilliant at it, and this valley needs you. And we build something together. Not because someone forged a letter, but because I can't imagine doing any of it without you anymore. Clara's breath caught. Are you saying that... I'm saying I spent 2 years convinced I'd used up my chance at happiness, that loving someone and losing them meant I didn't get to try again. Then you walked through a blizzard and saved everything I'd given up on, including myself. He cupped her face in his hands. I'm saying yes, to all of it. To you." She kissed him then, and it felt like the first warm day after endless winter, like promises made and meant, like two broken people finding out they fit together better than they'd ever fit alone. When they finally pulled apart, Claire was crying and laughing at the same time. "We should probably get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be brutal." "Probably," Ethan agreed. But neither of them moved. They stood on the porch holding each other while the stars came out and the temperature dropped and the cattle settled in for their last night in the winter pasture. Tomorrow would bring the cattle drive, the confrontation with distance and weather and the 100 things that could go wrong. But tonight was theirs, hard-won and precious and worth every impossible thing they'd survived to reach it. The morning of the 12th day dawned clear and cold. They were ready before sunrise, the cattle rested and fed, Hope and Darby harnessed, John Brennan's grandson waiting with the 2 borrowed horses. Sarah Garrett had come too, bringing her husband and oldest son to help manage the herd. "Valley's pulling for you," Sarah said as they prepared to move out. "Word spread about what you did here, about what Miss Hale did. People want to see you succeed." The drive started smoothly. The cattle, strengthened by nearly 2 weeks of good feed and clean water, moved well. Clara rode Hope, managing the front of the herd with calm confidence. Ethan brought up the rear with Darby, watching for stragglers. The Garretts and Brennan's grandson flanked the sides, keeping the group together. 12 miles. On good terrain with healthy cattle, it should have taken 6 hours. With recovering animals on winter roads, Ethan had planned for 8. They made it 7 miles before the pregnant heifer went down. She'd been moving well all morning, keeping pace with the herd. Then, without warning, her legs buckled and she collapsed in the snow. Clara was off Hope immediately, running to the heifer's side with Ethan right behind her. "She's calving," Clara said, her hands already examining the animal. Early, the stress of the drive triggered it. "Can we move her?" "Not until after. We have to deliver the calf here." Clara looked up at the sky, still clear, but afternoon was fading into evening. "Ethan, this could take hours. You need to keep the rest of the herd moving. Get them to Henderson's before dark. I'll stay with her." "I'm not leaving you alone in the middle of nowhere." "You're not leaving me alone. I'll have the heifer, and we're only 5 miles from Henderson's ranch. Once you deliver the herd, you can come back for us." She gripped his arm. "We're so close. We can't risk losing the entire deal because one animal needed help. The herd has to keep moving." Sarah Garrett stepped forward. "I'll stay with her. My mother was a midwife. I've helped with difficult births before. Between the 2 of us, we can manage." Ethan wanted to argue, wanted to stay and help and make sure nothing went wrong. But Clara was right. The herd had to keep moving. Henderson was expecting delivery before nightfall. If they failed now, after everything they'd survived, it would be because he'd been too afraid to trust that Clara could handle this without him. 5 miles, he said. "I'll be back as fast as I can." Clara stood on her toes and kissed him quickly. "We'll be here. Now go." The final 5 miles felt like 50. Ethan pushed the herd harder than he should have, driven by worry and the fading light. The Garrett's son and Brennan's grandson managed to keep the cattle together despite the increased pace. When Henderson's ranch finally appeared over the rise, Ethan felt relief so intense it was almost painful. Henderson was waiting, Sam Winters beside him. They counted the cattle as Ethan and his helpers drove them into the holding pen. 24 head, all healthy, all accounted for except the heifer. "Where's the 25th?" Henderson asked. "Calving, 5 miles back. Clara and Sarah Garrett are with her. The calf came early from the stress of the drive." Henderson's expression tightened. "That changes the count. 24 head isn't our deal." "The deal was 25 head delivered. She'll be delivered as soon as she can move, tonight or tomorrow morning at latest." Ethan kept his voice level despite the panic clawing at his chest. "She's part of the herd, you know she is. Don't renegotiate over a calving that couldn't be helped." Sam stepped forward. "Tom, the man delivered 24 healthy animals 12 miles in 1 day. The heifer was strong enough to make it 7 miles while calving. That's remarkable. And if the calf survives, you're getting a bonus animal you didn't pay for." Henderson studied Ethan for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "You've got until tomorrow noon to deliver the heifer. She arrives healthy with a living calf. I pay full price for 25 head plus $100 for the calf. She doesn't make it. Price drops to match the 24 count. Fair?" It was more than fair. It was generous. Deal. Ethan left immediately, pushing Darby harder than he should have, racing back through gathering darkness to where he'd left Clara. The temperature was dropping fast. If the birth went wrong, if Clara and Sarah couldn't handle complications, if he'd made the wrong choice leaving them. He found them by following the sound of Clara's voice, calm and steady in the darkness. She knelt in the snow beside the heifer, Sarah holding a lantern, both women working with focused intensity. The calf was already born, lying in the snow, and Clara was rubbing it vigorously with handfuls of straw. Is it, Ethan started, alive? Breathing? Female. Perfect. Clara looked up, and even in the lantern light, he could see her exhausted triumph. The mother's weak but stable. We need to get her up and moving before hypothermia sets in. Together, they coaxed the heifer to her feet. She was shaky but determined, nuzzling her newborn with the fierce protectiveness of new mothers everywhere. The calf struggled up on wobbling legs and immediately began nursing. Henderson's expecting them by noon tomorrow, Ethan said. Can they make it? They'll make it. Clara's confidence was absolute. We didn't survive everything else just to fail in the last 5 miles. They made camp there in the snow, building a fire and taking turns keeping watch while the heifer and calf rested. Sarah's husband arrived an hour later with blankets and hot food, having ridden back when he realized his wife hadn't returned. They sat around the fire and shared the meal. 4 people bound by the strange intimacy of crisis survived together. When dawn broke, they started the final journey. The heifer moved slowly but steadily, the calf wobbling along beside her. They reached Henderson's ranch at mid-morning, and when the heifer walked into the pen with her calf and joined the rest of the herd, a small crowd that had gathered to watch actually cheered. Henderson inspected the mother and calf personally. Damn fine animals, both of them. He pulled an envelope from his coat. $1,700 for the herd as agreed, $100 for the calf. And here, he produced a second, smaller envelope. Another $100 because you delivered every animal healthy and on time, despite circumstances that would have broken most operations. Call it a respect payment. Ethan stared at the envelopes. $1,900. More than enough to pay the bank, enough to buy feed for the remaining 7 cattle, enough to start repairs on the barn and fences, enough to breathe. Thank you, he managed. Thank your wife, Henderson said. She's the one who did the impossible part. They rode back to the Cole ranch in the wagon, Clara asleep against Ethan's shoulder again, the envelope secure in his pocket. The sun was high and warm, despite the winter cold. The valley spread before them, no longer looking like a graveyard, but like possibility. At the cabin, Ethan woke Clara gently. We're home. She blinked awake, smiled sleepily. Did you just call it home? Yeah, I did. They went to town the next day and paid off the bank in full. The banker's surprise was almost comical, paid Morrison's old debt despite his protests, bought supplies and materials, arranged for contractors to repair the barn in spring. That evening, they stood in the winter pasture with the 7 remaining cattle. The animals had continued improving, and Clara estimated they'd be ready for delivery to Henderson within another 3 weeks. Revenue from that sale would give them operating capital for the year. What should we call it? Clara asked. The ranch. You said it never had a real name. Ethan thought about the journey that had brought them here, the storm, the desperation, the impossible things they'd survived through sheer stubborn refusal to quit. Haven Ridge, he said. You mentioned it that first night, a place where people can find shelter, where broken things get fixed. Seems fitting. Haven Ridge, Claire repeated, testing it. I like it. It sounds like somewhere that matters. It does matter, because of you. She leaned into him, and they stood watching the sun set over land that had nearly been lost and was now saved. Not because of luck or miracles or divine intervention, because a woman had walked through a blizzard to find a man who'd given up, and together they'd proven that sometimes salvation didn't arrive as hope. It arrived as someone willing to work beside you when everything else had already failed. 6 months later, Haven Ridge had become exactly what Clara had envisioned. The barn stood repaired and strong. New fences marked clean property lines. The 7 cattle they'd kept had fully recovered and been bred to a bull Ethan had purchased with profits from the Henderson sale. The spring was capped and redirected, its copper-poisoned water no longer a threat. But the real transformation was in the steady stream of neighbors who came seeking Clara's medical expertise. She'd converted part of the barn into a proper treatment space, stocked with herbs she cultivated and medical supplies purchased with fees from grateful patients. Word had spread beyond the valley. People traveled from neighboring counties to see the woman who'd saved Mary Morrison and diagnosed what trained doctors had missed. The ranch made money now, not from cattle alone, though the herd was growing, but from Clara's practice, from boarding horses for travelers, from selling medicinal herbs to other practitioners. They diversified in ways Ethan had never imagined, built something resilient enough to weather the next drought or disaster. On their wedding day, a real wedding this time, no forged letters or desperate arrangements, the whole valley came to celebrate. Morrison gave Clara away. Mary Morrison stood as her attendant, and Henderson grudgingly admitted that Ethan Cole had married the smartest woman in Wyoming territory. That night, in the cabin that was truly theirs now, Clara lay in Ethan's arms and traced patterns on his chest. "Do you ever think about that Christmas Eve, when I knocked on your door?" "Every day." "Do you regret it? Any of it?" Ethan thought about the man he'd been, broken, defeated, ready to surrender to foreclosure and whiskey and slow death by loneliness. Then he thought about the man he'd become with Clara beside him, someone who fought for what mattered, someone who believed impossible things were worth attempting, someone who'd learned that loving again after loss wasn't betrayal. It was survival. "Not for a second," he said. "You?" Clara smiled against his shoulder. "I walked 9 miles through a blizzard to get here. If I regretted it, I'd be the biggest fool in the territory." Outside, the wind carried the promise of winter's first snow. Inside Haven Ridge, 2 people who'd started as strangers bound by a forged letter had built something real, something that would last, something that proved that sometimes the greatest salvation came not from being rescued, but from finding someone brave enough to build beside you when everyone else had already given up. The ranch that had been dying was alive again. The man who'd lost hope had found it, and the woman who'd been told she was too difficult to love had discovered that being difficult was exactly what survival required. Together, they'd turned desperation into purpose, failure into foundation, and a chance encounter in a Christmas storm into a love that would weather everything the frontier could throw at it, because that's what happened when 2 people refused to quit on each other, on themselves, or on the impossible dream that somewhere at the edge of everything, they could build a haven worth fighting for.